All right. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the New Stack Makers podcast. This week we're live on the show floor from Cloud Foundry Summit in Philadelphia, and we're doing podcasts with some of the participants and speakers here. And today the subject is empathy, and why empathy matters, makes for a better development process. And we have two guests on the show today. First we have Denise Yu, a software engineer from Pivotal, and you had recently contributed a post for us on why software, or why empathy matters in the software development process. And also we have with us Jai Schniepp from Liberty Mutual, and we're going to hear a bit more about why empathy matters from a perspective of managing developers. So welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Fantastic. Now I know empathy's been a big subject in the last few years. The old school way of thinking was the meritocracy of like, well, if you know your stuff, then therefore you should be elevated to the toppest role in the position. But as we're finding that this doesn't always work out for the best, so we have to start thinking about how we interact with other people in the workforce. And this is something that you delved into with your post quite a bit. I was wondering maybe you could talk to us about the importance of developing a sense of empathy if you're a developer or a manager.
Sure. So I am a software engineer. I've been working on product teams for the last 4 years of my career, and I've seen that regardless of whether you're building a product to be used by other companies or by end users, it really, really pays to spend some extra time trying to understand what your users' needs are.
Huh. All right. Nice. So it's not just a matter of making the perfect software, but I guess making the software that's perfect for the person who's going to use it.
Yeah, it's about understanding what problem this person is actually trying to solve and what kinds of solutions you might be able to design for them. Sometimes the best solution might not involve writing any code at all, but I think it also is about the relationships that you build with your customers along the way. That's an incredibly important part of building software that actually helps people. Nice.
Now I know. I don't know how does one build a sense of empathy if you're a developer, if you don't already have it.
I think that empathy is definitely a skill that is cultivated rather than something that you're born with. I've been thinking a lot about this over the years. Pivotal makes empathy a core part of our culture. That's something that I'm really grateful for because it's given me it's given me a lot of room to grow. And so in terms of how do you actually grow empathy skills, I think one huge thing is getting out of the room, getting out of the office and going to talk to users if you're designing for end users. I think within a team, it's also about making sure that we're giving each other feedback on what is and isn't working, that we have frameworks for honest and thoughtful communication with one another, and that we always try to think about the human at the center of everything when things go wrong. Because no software is perfect. You're just never going to be able to write code that never errors. Things are going to go wrong. And when things go wrong, it really is about trying to figure out how do we have a blameless conversation around the incident, and how do we optimize for learning rather than justice, maybe.
So instead of justice.
Yeah.
So you just can't blame the user of the software.
No.
If they're not using the software.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You definitely should not be blaming the user. I think that's a huge red flag. I think if you're blaming the user, it's a very strong signal to look at what kind of inputs you're currently gathering. What are your hypotheses? Who are you talking to? Are the people you're gathering a lot of input from actually representative of your end user?
Nice. So it's just not enough to read the manual. And you have to go that extra distance.
Yeah, exactly.
So Jay, now we were talking a bit about empathy from the perspective not so much of the users, but of the developers. Now, you're with Liberty Mutual.
I am, yep.
And I'm not sure if I mentioned that, but you're a senior product owner for cloud and security.
Yep.
And so you must work with developers quite a bit.
We do, and I work within the central organization, so all of our customers, or consumers as we call them, our users, are developers. So we're peers. So sometimes I say to the team, don't be so audacious that you think you know better than the actual user of our product. Because because you use it in a different way. You have different privileges, you have different access. So we want to be very mindful that we're really listening to where their problems are occurring, because those same problems may not occur with those of us as platform managers or platform operators.
Oh, nice. I remember early days of Netscape. They developed a browser. This is the late '90s, and they had the ability to show full-size images. Now, this is great, but everybody out there in user land was still on 28.8 modem.
Right.
They're like, this is taking forever.
Yep.
So stuff like that, like understanding who is using the software.
Right. And understanding how they're using it. So I know Denise talked a little bit about user research and really watching our developers leverage our platforms and tools, because we can't assume that we know how they're going to travel through our process, what buttons they're going to click on. We don't understand their organizational structure and how they may need to put together something like separation of duties. So when you think about who has the right access and privileges, you really have to sit down and talk to those teams to understand how they're organized, because it's going to be different than our own.
Nice. Now, I would imagine this also applies to not only working for end users, but for fellow developers as well.
You go.
Yeah, absolutely. I work in PCF within Pivotal Cloud Foundry, and we have probably 30 or 40 different teams all working on different parts of the platform. And the team I'm on actually right now is one of the teams that help to make sure that things get released in the right order, and that we can provide confidence around the upgrade journey for our customers. And as one of so we have some teams that are hubs and some teams that are spokes. As a developer on one of the hub teams right now, it's so easy to get frustrated at people who are not in the same meetings as you, who are working on different backlogs as you, and just get annoyed over things like, oh, well, why didn't they just read our documentation? Like, why didn't they follow our process? But that's not useful. That's not a productive way to think. A more interesting question is, what was wrong with the process that we designed so that people can't use it easily? If you reframe the question as trying to remove as many obstacles as possible from the user, then I think it becomes a much more interesting and productive conversation. Yeah,
from that standpoint at Liberty, we talk a lot about positive intent and really thinking about how people are leveraging our tools and services, and they're not intending to make it difficult for us, and they're not obviously intending to make it difficult for themselves. So we really think about how can we make this positive, how can we assume their best interests are in mind, but obviously there's something wrong with how we're either communicating, documenting, sharing our information, so it's just more difficult for them to understand what our process is. And in all honesty, we probably communicated incorrectly.
So it sounds like even the end user could actually be using it wrong, and so you could say, well, they're so dumb, they're not using it correctly, but still that points to a larger failure of communication on the side of the software provider then.
Yeah, I would say they're using it not as intended, not necessarily wrong.
Per se, yeah. Oh, okay. Terrific. Now,
positive intent.
Positive intent. Don't necessarily assume that the other person is being malicious when they weigh criticism.
Absolutely.
Yep.
All right. Excellent. Now you had an interesting, a great. I guess it's a panel discussion yesterday. Oh, it was a panel, but it was a keynote discussion, and you had mentioned something about don't just stop listening to the loudest person in the room.
Yep.
And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about what you meant by that.
Sure. The story that I actually didn't have time to tell on stage yesterday was I recently learned a really interesting story about the early days of Amazon Web Services.
Oh, all right.
So in early days, they had a customer support forum, and people from the community would sort of chime in and help other users who were, earlier in their journey and getting stuck. The Amazon Web Services team would also use the forum to talk to their end users and gather product input and beta test features and that kind of thing. There was one user who was super active, and he provided tons and tons of input to the product team, many of which ended up becoming features in AWS and products. And 7 years on from these conversations, the AWS team finally asked, how much money does this guy actually spend on Amazon Web Services? And it turned out he was spending like $10 a month.
Oh, really?
Yeah, something ridiculously low.
Nice.
So It's so interesting
It
that
can come from anywhere. Good feedback can come from anywhere.
Yeah, exactly. Good feedback can come from anywhere, and I think it's important to think carefully about people's problems and their needs rather than like the size of their usage. Of course, like how much usage someone like is consuming informs their use cases. Like, of course, it adds color to their input. But I think that it's really important not to discard input just because someone is a light user or because they are not the person who are, like shouting the loudest in GitHub issues or anything like that.
And to that point too, I think about I've been an AWS product manager at Liberty prior to this current role, and they also just might be a super user in the fact that they're actually using cloud appropriately. So they're shutting everything down when they're not using it. So they're just very effective in their implementation of whatever they were doing on AWS.
Nice.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that possibility, but you're totally right. Yeah.
So how do you reach these quieter people, noisier people? They'll find you.
Yeah.
But how do you find the quieter voices or the voices who may not speak up?
I think when you're developing open source software, it's really, really hard. I have so much respect for people who work in developer advocacy, developer evangelism, because their job literally is to build the kind of relationships between the product teams and the community so that you can find these voices. And it's really challenging. I don't personally work in that field, but Jay does, so.
Yeah. When we look at trying to get additional feedback and trying to talk to different users, we look at things like logs. So we do look at who's been using the software more often, but also we had the privilege. We are a Pivotal customer, and we had the privilege of doing cloud native workshops for the last 2 years in partnership with Pivotal. So we would hold workshops and really end to end in one day teach our developers how to use the services, how they integrate with the other tools and platforms that we have at Liberty, and really walk them through the process. So with those workshops, we were able to identify super users, we were able to identify new users, and the amount of feedback we got from our lead developer advocate, he knew more about how people used our software than anyone else, just by watching, an expert all the way down to a newbie, and then really taking that documentation, sharing it with our product owners, so we really understood, what was going on.
Excellent. How do you determine? There's always anecdotal evidence.
Sure.
Like one person wants X feature, but how do you determine if this is something that you should consider adding a feature, or if this is kind of just like an edge case that maybe should be pushed down in the priority list? How do you determine the good feedback versus the kind of edge cases?
Yeah, I think you start with asking others if that resonates with them. Is that, and also, I try to step away from someone asking for a direct feature and challenging them on what problem are they trying to solve.
Interesting.
Because the problem could be solved in many different ways, and the problem may be shared by others. Maybe that solution that they're speaking to us about is unique to them, So really getting back to, and I know Denise said this earlier, what's the problem we're solving, and going from there.
Yeah. I think as a product team, it also really pays to have alignment on your roadmap and your priorities. Yeah. So I briefly worked on the Bosch team, on the Bosch core team, and that was a lot of fun. And we spent a long time thinking about security, because obviously security is a huge thing for all Bosch users. Yeah. And so we decided that was going to be one of our priorities. So if edge cases come up, if feature requests come up, if it's clearly linked to improving security in the platform, then we should look at that very seriously.
Yeah.
Nice. So now you obviously work, Jay. You work with a lot of vendors yourself.
Yep.
I mean, what's the state of the industry in terms of understanding the concept of empathy? I mean, is there some who get it and some who don't? Any ones you want to mention?
Yeah. No, I think it's right, and I think actually a lot of what's driven empathy through our organization has been our partnership with Pivotal and understanding, how they work, how they operate. We've been able to do dojos with them to start to improve our developer experience and understand, again, what problems our developers had and we're looking to solve. I think as an industry as a whole, I think it's getting better. I find our vendors are asking more questions, engaging us more in their roadmaps and where they're trying to go. I think a couple years ago, we would just be handed a roadmap or a Gantt chart, for lack of a better word, and said, this is when things are coming. But now we're having active conversations through customer advisory boards and other mediums with our sales team or our TAMs, where we're being asked, we're providing answers, and it's really much more of an open conversation.
Nice. Terrific. How does one? It's always as a developer, you'd obviously want to go out and talk to your users and find out what they're thinking about. But how do you incorporate that into an enterprise culture? How do you put that as a line item, I guess, in terms of institutionalizing empathy? You had said Pivotal does a good job of that. What sort of ways does it manifest itself?
Yeah, so one of the people who taught me a lot about this actually is Therese Stowell, who is the product director for the London office, and she and I have had many conversations around this concept called balanced teams, and essentially it goes, you identify all the tasks that need to be done on a team. You don't attach those tasks to a role, although oftentimes, closing a pull request is probably going to be something that a developer will do, but you're agnostic about that at this point. Once you figure out all the tasks that need to be done, you just put it into the middle of a pile, and we re-ask ourselves, how can we share these responsibilities so that we all build alignment on where we're going and why and who our customers are. So one concrete way that I've changed the way that I work as a result of doing these kinds of activities is having an open door policy for every customer conversation so that anyone on the team can come along. Engineers are encouraged to be part of customer conversations. That shouldn't be just the domain of product managers and designers. By talking to customers directly, you build a lot of empathy. We also are trying to pair more with our first line support staff. They're our heroes, basically. They're the firefighters who, when something goes wrong in a customer environment, they are the first people on the line, and they will be on calls for often hours or days just trying to figure something out. So it really pays to have R&D engineers pair with support staff and see what do customer issues look like in real life, because we're quite distance from that in our day-to-day development. We're sort of heads down in a backlog. So I think trying to get out of the mentality that engineers do backlog is a really important part of making the whole team a little more well-rounded and putting empathy closer to the center of how we operate.
Nice. Is this something that should go back to the computer science curriculum in colleges? It just seems to be that when you decide on comp sci as a major, then you're encouraged to become, I guess, independent as a programmer, figure stuff out yourself. I mean, is there a way you could add empathy in or rethink about how you do programming at a fundamental level?
I mean, I think it's an important part of how we become inclusive. So how you incorporate it into a class like that, I'm certainly not an expert in educational design. I chose IT for a reason, but I think it's really about prioritizing, being inclusive, caring about others, listening. I can't say enough about how important just listening is. Acknowledging what you hear, making people feel like, their opinion matters, even when it's different from yours. Starting to think that it's not and, it could be both, that's not either or, and really starting to just grow. But as far as how do you put it into comp sci class, I don't know.
I think you can try to hire for it. I mean, that's later in the pipeline. But I also would struggle to think about how you would design this into a curriculum.
And we just need to be nicer people in general. As a collective, culture. And
This is true. And you brought up the point of inclusivity too.
Sure.
And we had a pancake podcast this morning, and one of the speakers I forgot who mentioned that if you have lack of a better word, a kind of a uniform, basically all white young guys.
Yeah.
You're not bringing in the views and the different kind of perspectives, and this actually affects the end quality of the software because it's a very narrow channel that they're writing to.
Sure. You know, from my perspective, it's not necessarily about injecting other personalities or people types, for lack of a better word.
Right.
It's more about making sure that the folks that are involved aren't being exclusive. So how do you ensure that they're listening to other thoughts, different point of views, and bringing others along with them? So really looking for those allies, those personal allies that can, bring, us as women into those conversations.
Nice.
Because again, positive intent, no one's meaning to exclude us from this, right?
Excellent. Any other empathy tips?
I think a really good communication tip that I learned from my brother, who actually is a social worker in South Boston. So arguably, if I make a mistake at work, then maybe I cause an outage. But if he makes a mistake, then literally, a kid's life, has a different outcome. So different stakes. So for him, one big thing that he's taught me over the years is you don't get anything done unless you build trust between the person you're trying to help and yourself. And so when he tries to give someone advice, he'll always first ask the question, would you like me to listen or would you like us to problem solve together?
Oh, that's awesome.
And I think if you get into the habit of checking for that kind of consent in as many interactions as possible, it really goes a long way, and it'll help you to build empathy into like the default way that you interact with each other.
I think, as a default, those of us in technology are problem solvers naturally. Right. So, I mean, I don't think I could. Right. How do I help? Let me think about it. Like, I have experience. I can share this with you. Let me try to fix it for you. And sometimes people just want to get it off their chest. They just want to share. Yep. And they don't need you to problem solve right away. So I couldn't follow that if I tried. That's awesome.
Nice. All right. Fantastic. Well, Jay and Denise, thank you so much for taking time to talk with us.
You're welcome.
And yes, thank you, watchers and listeners, for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you.